welcome everybody on behalf of the Barbara Harrell-Bond Foundation to this event, which is a way of remembering Barbara, but also celebrating her legacy. Barbara Harrell-Bond founded the Refugee Studies program in Oxford, but then was also an activist and not only an academic, but an activist, and also set up a whole range of legal aid programs and refugee studies programs across the world. And also in the last part of her life, she was actively involved in supporting refugees through legal means. So we're very pleased that we are here today to celebrate really her legacy. And I'm welcoming you. My name is Georgia Dona, and on behalf of the foundation, I welcome you to this event. Now, just a few words about the foundation. The Barbara Harrell-Bond Foundation was set up soon after she unfortunately left us on the 11th of July of 2018. And the main aim of the foundation really is very simple, is to keep Barbara's legacy alive and promoting her work and aspirations and approaches in the field of refugees and asylum seeker studies. We have three main objectives really at the foundation. The first one is to create and maintain an online archive of Barbara's work, the pictures, the documents, all the papers she published, both the ones that came out and the ones that are in the great literature, because Barbara wrote a lot and don't exist in the public. So there maybe I can ask Gabi if she can put in the chat the link to the foundation, so you can, when you have time, look at the archive we have. And for those of you who have known Barbara, who may have photos of Barbara, please do share them with us, because we try to keep this as a participatory project with all the people who have crossed paths with Barbara, and we know there are many, many of them. The second aim of the foundation really is, in the spirit of Barbara's very applied practical approach, is to raise funds and also donate micro grants to asylum seekers who are in need. At the moment, we do that in the UK for administrative purposes. But again, if you want to donate, you can have a link. But also, if you don't want to donate at this moment, but you can advertise and promote the work of the foundation and its aim at helping asylum seekers and refugees, please do. That is also a great contribution that you can make to the work and to keep her legacy alive. And the third aim of the foundation is to organize events to remember her, but also to celebrate her legacy. And this is one of these events today. So welcome to all of you. And what we decided to do at the foundation is to, and there are a number of members here as well that may be talking to you in the end, maybe in the question time. The main aim of the event today is to focus on Barbara's legacy in the area of human rights and legal aid. And that's why we have selected a fantastic list of people who have known Barbara and work in this field. Just few housekeeping notes before we start. So the event is going to be recorded. So for those of you who don't want it to be, your comments to be recorded, you can put them in the chat, or you can tell us afterwards, and we can, if you want to make a comment, we can then edit the video. You can add questions and comments in the chat as we talk, as the speakers talk, and then we have some time. We're aiming, the speakers will keep their presentation short to allow everybody who's in this kind of virtual room to be able to ask questions about the current work and the legacy of Barbara's work, and also to contribute to the conversation. So without further ado, let me then just start by introducing the first speaker of the event today. I'm going to follow the order that we have in the list. And sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Georgia Dona, and I work at the University of East London, but I'm here on behalf of the foundation today. So without further ado, let me introduce, it's a great pleasure to introduce to Sabine Lariber, who is the recently appointed new director of AMERA, which is one of the organizations that Barbara was involved in setting up. So Sabine, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Georgia, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak in our pre-meet. Just before, I was saying that I was particularly thrilled to be inviting to talk, having started work at AMERA as the director earlier this year, and in that time, of course, it's been a real, so much has been coming to me in terms of Barbara and her work and her approach and these sorts of things. So it's lovely to get the opportunity to talk about that and also to think about it a little bit more. Yeah, so I mean, Barbara set up AMERA about 20 years ago. My sort of history with Barbara and her work has also been connected through my work in Egypt. I was one of the directors at St. Andrew's Refugee Services in Egypt that was also quite significantly shaped by Barbara's work in Egypt, in particular its legal aid programming, and in particular its psychosocial programming and how that works together with legal aid, of course with the sort of constant backdrop of CMRS in Egypt. I was also the coordinator of the Unaccompanied Children and Youth Programme at AMERA Egypt about a decade ago, and at that time worked with Barbara quite a bit, and have had various bits to do with her ever since, really. So my own background is in both sort of legal work as well as mental health and psychosocial support, and in direct assistance, and how these all intersect, all of which has been influenced by Barbara's work, and all of which Barbara touched on in various different ways in what she researched and wrote about and talked about. So I want to talk briefly about what Barbara knew and how it has shaped us, really. As I mentioned, my recent work with AMERA has been a really wonderful opportunity to reflect on this, which I haven't gone in with that intention, but I am inevitably drawn to and continually coming across the roots of so much of what we now consider to be important found in Barbara's work. Also so often struck by what she knew long before it became acceptable to talk about such things. She, of course, Barbara researched and wrote extensively on refugee rights, and I've been rereading some bits of her work where she talks about humanitarian assistance for refugees, where she touches on the political violence imbued in so much humanitarian aid, and about the need to identify, know, and fight against such violence, even when it is there under the guise of compassion. And I have found it challenging and really insightful to be reading again about her work in that regard. She considered who was best placed to take action in the interests of refugees. She talked about, without necessarily using the language, but about localization, about UNHCR and about NGOs' role in the way assistance is delivered long before it was the topic of this year's UNHCR NGO consultations. In imposing aid, Barbara talks about the critical role of refugee participation and leadership in the research she was doing, how meaningful knowledge, insight, and realization of refugee rights only comes through involvement of refugees themselves, and how much that gave to the research that she was doing. How this is manifested practically is a continual question for us all as we work within the refugee rights field. And I think it's particularly relevant, and a lot of what we have been thinking about within AMERA recently is also that within legal aid, recognizing the role of refugee leadership has generally been even further behind. And as Barbara spoke of how refugee rights can improve access to justice for all, so we need to think for how refugee leadership within access to justice can take this even further. Barbara was passionate about the development of refugee legal aid in the global South. And as AMERA, we've been meeting as part of our work with legal aid organizations across the global South. And we are so often informed of the influence of Barbara on legal aid programs, not only in Africa and the Middle East, but also much wider. And the influence sort of ranges from being a source of inspiration to so often practically engaging in developing legal aid services in areas of need, in things that we didn't even realize that she had done, but she did, and she had such an influence on. We've had discussions with organizations in the last few months in India, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Hong Kong, in Cameroon, in Egypt. The list goes on. And so often Barbara's name is given as a real source of inspiration. We are also inspired by those providing direct legal aid in challenging circumstances. And as AMERA, we're really developing a growing desire ourselves to adapt what we're doing, the approach we're taking, and learn again from movements of refugee legal aid organizations in the Global South. We also want to work with others for sharing knowledge and experience on other things that Barbara knew. She has shaped our knowledge, my knowledge from a long time ago, in the work that I was doing in AMERA Egypt, our knowledge as AMERA International, on how acknowledging and addressing mental health is a critical aspect of the refugee status determination process, that it is integral to protection, well-being, and access to justice. And AMERA is working now to connect with organizations across the Global South to really share knowledge and practices in this regard, and to make sure that it is a critical part of legal aid across the world. Barbara knew about the role legal aid organizations in the Global South could play in monitoring and responding to the rights and justice issues arising from deportations. And we are really pleased to have taken back on the deportation monitoring network that Barbara started many years ago, and that AMERA has recently taken back on, and we're really looking forward to building on that work again. As we plan for our own work over the coming years, we continually come back to what Barbara knew, and the areas of work that really have been shaped by her legacy. And we are very excited. I am very excited for where this is going to take us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for again reminding us of Barbara's holistic approach, including psychosocial and the international work you do, and also this important contemporary legacy around deportation. So thank you very much. And without further ado, let me just then move on to Susan. Susan Alupo is also works at the Refugee Law Project, which is one of the other centers that Barbara set up in a different part of the African continent. So Susan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Donna. A good evening to all of you, and those who are in the morning zone, good morning. Those in the afternoon zone, good afternoon. My name is Susan Alupo, and I work with the Refugee Law Project. I specifically manage one of our thematic programs titled Access to Justice. Now, the Refugee Law Project is situated in Uganda, and Uganda is in the eastern part of Africa. I am inviting all of you to Uganda to come and see the great works that Barbara Harrell-Bond did. So the Refugee Law Project was established following an extensive research that was conducted in the 90s by Barbara Harrell-Bond. Through her research, she established that while Uganda was doing great in hosting refugees and asylum seekers, when it came to enjoyment of their rights, there was a huge gap. She also established that while Uganda had a very great open door policy in receiving refugees, asylum seekers, there were very few legal aid institutions that were responding to the needs of refugees. Knowing that people are fleeing from different countries and coming into Uganda, it was quite challenging for asylum seekers and refugees to integrate. But nevertheless, it was complicated for them to live in a country with different legal and administrative systems, which are different from those in their home countries. Majority of the asylum seekers were from non-English speaking countries, and the official language in Uganda was English. So it was hard for them to ideally integrate, but also supporting the refugee status determination processes was almost impossible because there was no one to support these refugees. So through that research, Barbara tirelessly worked and moved to the School of Law, Cairo University, to speak to the faculty to discuss the possibility of establishing a project that would then extend support to refugees and asylum seekers. She lobbied through a range of stakeholders in Uganda and stood firm, clearly stating that if refugees, asylum seekers are to enjoy their rights in Uganda, then we need to establish a project dedicated to extending support. So in 1999, the Refugee Law Project was established as a community outreach project of the School of Law, Cairo University, primarily to provide legal aid for refugees and asylum seekers. We've seen the project grow from then to now have 5 thematic programs. And one of the programs that we have at the project is the Access to Justice program, which was the foundation of Barbara Harrell-Bond, legal aid. So that program seeks to ensure that forced migrants access appropriate forms of justice while in Uganda and live dignified lives, ideally providing legal representation, supporting people in the refugee status determination processes, monitoring places of detention to extend legal aid to refugees and asylum seekers who may need it, because at times people are arrested and they go straight to detention facilities. The program has also been very instrumental in building the capacity of state and non-state actors. So if we are to ensure that the needs of refugees are responded to effectively, then there is need to enhance the capacities of officers within the government, but also non-state actors. Barbara realized that there was limited knowledge among the actors in Uganda on refugee rights and protection. People were not interested in knowing refugee issues. So because of that, as RLP, we continue to enhance their capacity such that they can effectively respond to the needs of refugees and asylum seekers. And we are seeing that change in practice. The program also is involved in a lot of advocacy for reform in law policy and practice. Barbara laid the foundation for research when she established the Refugee Law Project, and that is something we continue to carry up to today, conducting research and advocacy on key legal issues affecting refugees. And we are seeing policies and laws changing from time to time to fit the context of the refugees and asylum seekers. She also spearheaded aspects of empowerment, which RLP continues to do up to today. We reach out to communities within urban areas and in settlements and teach them the different laws and policies in Uganda, peaceful coexistence between refugees and host communities, how to approach the different justice institutions, something we continue to do up to today. And an interesting thing that the Refugee Law Project is doing is teaching refugees and asylum seekers English. We call it basic English and literacy skills, because one of the greatest challenges refugees and asylum seekers face is language barrier. So for us to break that, we teach English through the Speak Your Rights course to empower them to be able to demand for their rights, but also defend themselves while in Uganda. So another exciting program at the Refugee Law Project is the mental health and psychosocial program that builds from the legal aid. While we realized that legal aid was very fundamental for refugees, it was also established that you cannot respond to the legal aid needs without dealing with the psychosocial issues that refugees and asylum seekers face. Knowing the negative impacts of conflict and what it presents to people, the mental health and psychosocial well-being program seeks to offer psychosocial support to refugees and asylum seekers. So ideally extending counseling services at family level, individual level, and also at group level. One interesting thing that the program does is to bring together refugees and asylum seekers in different groups. People who have undergone similar experiences come together in small groups and are able to share those experiences, but are seen as ambassadors to reach out to others who may not be able to speak. So we have groups like those of women with children born out of rape, victims of sexual violence, torture victims. So these youth, all these come together and are able to.
May I ask those of you to mute yourselves? Thank you, while Susan is talking, thank you.
So these groups are champions. They reach out to other refugees within the communities with specific needs, and they refer to the Refugee Law Project for support. So we have the Gender and Sexuality program. At the Refugee Law Project, we screen people for sexual violence, and 7 out of 10 people screen positive for sexual and gender-based violence. So the Gender and Sexuality program basically seeks to ensure that people enjoy and access their sexual and gender-being rights while in Uganda. The program is very instrumental in documentation on issues of conflict-related sexual violence, and it has spearheaded advocacy on male survivors of sexual violence. Many times when we speak of sexual violence, it's limited to women and girls, but through documentation of this program, it's been established that men and boys are also victims of sexual violence. So the program has championed this at national level, regional level, but also international level, pushing for recognition of male survivors of sexual violence. The program also extends psychosocial support to victims of sexual and gender-based violence, and has been involved in a lot of advocacy at national level with a range of key stakeholders on issues of prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence. And we are seeing a change in some of the laws and policies in Uganda on sexual and gender-based violence, but also we are hearing the voices of the victims of conflict-related sexual violence. So that has been a great plus for that program. We have the Conflict, Transitional Justice and Governance Program, also one of the key programs at the Refugee Law Project that seeks to address legacies of past human rights violations. So when people hear Refugee Law Project, they think we only deal with refugees and asylum seekers, but we also extend support to nationals. If you're in a country that is hosting over 1.6 million refugees, but also in a country that has had a turbulent past, then it becomes prudent to also extend legal aid to nationals. So through this program, we ideally also identify persons who have suffered from conflict and refer them for treatment. We have partnerships with different hospitals and health centers that identify these victims and refer them for treatment. We do a lot of psychosocial support to Ugandans who have also been affected by conflict. The program does a lot of community outreach to different communities in Uganda that were affected with the conflict. But the whole aspect is to link refugees to nationals and ensure that there's a smooth network between refugees and host communities. Through that program, we run what we call a museum, and I would want all of you to come and visit our museum. It's in the northern part of Uganda. You need to spare time and come and visit Uganda. But then what the museum does, we call it the National Memory and Peace Documentation Center, where we document and archive past and present conflict events. So if there are conflicts that haven't happened in Uganda in the past, we document that. The present conflicts happening in the country are also documented. So it's an interesting place if you'd want to understand Uganda's conflict history. So we do a lot of support, and we have visitors who come in to see artifacts and some of the different things we showcase in the museum. Through that program, we also monitor and document trials. I mean, if you've been following what was happening at the ICC, we have former rebel members who were convicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So we have Dominic Ongwen, who was prosecuted and convicted by the International Criminal Court. So through that program, we basically monitor and document, but also ensure that victims in Uganda follow such processes to see that justice is done. Also, internally within Uganda, we have the International Crimes Division, where we monitor and document prosecution of cases. We also have rebel leaders there who are being prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So we link this to the community to ensure that they are seeing justice being done for violations that happen in the country. Our last program is the Media for Social Change, basically that seeks to amplify the voices of refugees and asylum seekers. We've seen that the best way to advocate for issues of refugees and asylum seekers is to use the refugees themselves to speak to key issues affecting them. So we empower refugees through training them on video advocacy skill, photography, but also for them to be able to engage in debates at national and regional level to speak to the key challenges they continue to face as refugees and asylum seekers. And we're seeing that work. And for us, it's kind of a sustainability strategy that refugees should continue voicing out. And when they voice out this, the government stakeholders and different agencies react faster. So we call it the Media for Social Change, and we do a lot of social media advocacy through that program. So the foundation that Barbara Harrell-Bond laid has pushed for the growth of the Refugee Law Project. And I must speak with confidence that when it comes to legal aid, the Refugee Law Project is the only organization in Uganda providing direct court representation to refugees and asylum seekers, an aspect that was introduced by Barbara Harrell-Bond and will continue to shine with the work she created. And when you see the situation of refugees and asylum seekers, it has changed. From 1999 to today, we are seeing more progressive laws and policies being developed by the government. And when you see or follow what is being said about Uganda, they usually hear Uganda has one of the best laws and policies when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers. And we've seen that change because of the foundation she laid. And as people working in the Refugee Law Project, we continue to push for that, and we'll continue to fly up because of the work she did. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Susan. And it's great to see how the program has expanded with such an integrationist approach, involving like residents and also working in the areas of, you know, language, as well as media and museums. So that's a great legacy that has left. So Barbara has left. So that's something that we can all be kind of proud of at this particular moment in time when the situation is good. And it's great you're making change in policies and advocacy in Uganda. So that's good. And let's then move on. We have just now introducing you Pamela Groder, who works at St. Andrew's Refugee Service in Egypt. So over to you, Pamela.
Thank you so much, Georgia, and hello to everyone here. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Pamela Groder, and I am currently the Director of the Unaccompanied Children and Youth Department at St. Andrew's Refugee Services, also known as STARS, in Egypt, here in Cairo. I arrived in Cairo exactly 9 years ago in 2013, and I first worked for AMERA, which was founded by Barbara Harrell-Bond. I had the unique opportunity to meet with Barbara during my time as working with AMERA, and I got to know her as a very fierce advocate for refugee rights. And she, from then on, sort of also inspired the work that I have been doing, particularly with refugee children, but in general in the field. Given that my expertise is child protection and the provision of unaccompanied children and youth services, I wanted to take this opportunity tonight to just reiterate a little bit the situation of unaccompanied children here in Cairo, the issues that they face, but also linked to the advocacy efforts that STARS is doing with a particular focus on refugee leadership. When I first started working in Egypt 9 years ago, there were around 800 unaccompanied children in Egypt, which is a lot fewer in numbers than it is currently. Egypt now is home for 285,000 refugees and asylum seekers, and around 4,000 of these are unaccompanied and separated children. Unaccompanied children face particular challenges, such as a lack of access to education, proper healthcare, financial assistance, as well as the trauma that they've been through on their journeys of coming to Egypt, and the discrimination and protection concerns that they face in Cairo. For example, for unaccompanied children and youth to access education, this is a major challenge. Many of the children here come from Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia, as well as other nationalities. And these nationalities are not acknowledged to enter the Egyptian public schools systems because of certain regulations here in the country. Unaccompanied children therefore can only enroll in life skill courses that are provided by local organizations, but again, because of that, they cannot access higher education levels. Another major challenge for unaccompanied children is that they struggle to cover their basic needs. The lucky ones, those who are 17 and under, receive 900 Egyptian pounds, which are approximately 40 British pounds per month. With this money, they have to cover all their costs, including transportation, their housing rents, their access to food, to medication, to hygiene projects, to school equipment, and so on. Of course, that's not sufficient to address their needs. And as such, a lot of the children are forced to engage in dangerous work forms, such as domestic work and working on construction sites. Many of them are subjected to long work hours, like not sufficient pay, discrimination at work, and many of the girls face sexual violence. COVID-19 and this economic situation in Egypt, which has been deteriorating, made the protection and psychosocial environment for refugees in general, but unaccompanied children in particular, more and more challenging. So at STARS, at St. Andrew's Refugee Services, what we are trying to do is to provide psychosocial, legal, education, and community outreach services to refugees and vulnerable migrants in order to address some of these issues. However, one of the key challenges that we are facing when it comes to UNHCR and international NGOs is that refugees are very often not consulted in the decision-making processes that affect their lives. So a lot of the services that are provided to them are just decided upon without any consultations. And this is something that Barbara has been talking about and writing about for a long time already. And years and years and years later, nothing really has changed, which is quite shocking to see. For STARS, we have recently, about a year ago, moved to being a refugee-led organization. So the majority of our leadership group at STARS comes from a forcibly displaced community. And as such, on an institutional level, decisions are made by forcibly displaced communities, and we can adjust our services better to meet the needs that refugees and forced migrants have. This is on an institutional basis, but like more widely in Cairo and in Egypt, that's not the case. And when it comes to, for example, working groups of UNHCR and international organizations, refugee-based organizations are mostly absolutely not part of it. And decisions on protection, education, and cash-based interventions, they are not consulted and they are just made on their behalf. At STARS, alongside a network of refugee-led organizations, we essentially advocate for refugee leadership on a local and on a global level, demanding that refugees do not only have a seat at the table, but own the table. And this is something that Modas Alaham, one of our former refugee directors, fiercely demanded. And we sort of live by as an organization. To bring it back to unaccompanied children and youth, I'd like to give you an example of our Youth Advisory Board, which is fighting very hard on their voices being heard and considered in decision-making processes. So the STARS Youth Advisory Board is composed of 8 unaccompanied youth, aged 18 to 21 years old, who come from different nationalities and who provide a bridge between our youth staff, unaccompanied children and youth clients, and the management staff at STARS and external audiences. The Youth Advisory Board regularly meets with donors, with foreign ambassadors, with visitors, and explain their personal journeys and their life here in Egypt, discuss the challenges that unaccompanied children and youth face, but also present ideas of how to improve services. The Youth Advisory Board raises their voices and is a successful example of how youth can be involved in decision-making processes. Recently, 2 of the Youth Advisory Board members wrote an article called Bridging Youth and Power, the Youth Advisory Board in Cairo, for the Forced Migration Review. And the Forced Migration Review, as many of you know, was established a long time ago by Barbara. The article is basically addressing the achievements of these young leaders in helping them to raise awareness on the issues of unaccompanied children and youth, and they are trying to inspire greater inclusion of their voices being heard and being part of decision-making and policy discussions. They also highlight the need to recognize the knowledge and skills that do not fit into the traditional education pathway. As explained earlier, many of these young people do not have access to regular education, to high school diplomas, to university degrees, but yet they have a lot to say and a lot to bring to the table. As such, they are trying to advocate for their voices to be heard and basically to help to deconstruct the barriers to their inclusion and representation. We believe that the Youth Advisory Board can be a model for other international organizations on how to have young refugees included in discussions. The potential that the youth have should be recognized and should be supported. Barbara Harrell-Bond, I believe, would truly be proud to see that these young people are fighting and bringing their knowledge and their lived experience to decision-making and other processes. Although it might be still a long way to go, we believe that it's the only way for refugees not to only be consulted, but to actually take a lead on decision-making. And hopefully one day that is the norm and not anymore the exception. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Pamela, for highlighting again another important point that Barbara always kept reminding us, that refugees, as you said, not only need to have a voice, but need to lead the conversation. And it sounds as if her legacy is quite alive in the programs you lead. So that's really, again, another excellent example of her legacy. So then let's move on then to Martin Jones, who is representing the Egyptian Foundation for Refugee Rights. So Martin, over to you. I know you've also known Barbara. So
thanks, Georgia. Yes, before the event, we were all reminiscing about the things that brought us together. I mean, our various connections to Barbara. And in fact, the story I'm going to tell you of the Egyptian Foundation for Refugee Rights is really a story of Barbara bringing me and a few other people together. I first met Barbara actually when I was a reluctant by Barbara, invitee to a workshop that she ran in Nairobi. Reluctant because I think she had hoped to get a much bigger name than me to help her out with a workshop. But you know, to her credit, she settled and made good use of me, and we were friends ever since after that. So the story I'm telling you about EFRR is actually a story about Barbara introducing me a few years after our first encounter in Nairobi to an Egyptian lawyer, simply because she knew I was a lawyer also, and we both, me and Mohammed, both found ourselves in Geneva, him without a place to stay, and she knew that I was in Geneva at the time and had a bit more space where I was staying. And so we became roommates because Mohammed was in Geneva to pursue advocacy with UNHCR on a really difficult case. And as those of you who know Barbara know, there was nothing that she was often more focused on than kind of advocacy to UNHCR to get things right, particularly when it involved individual cases of refugees. So that friendship with Mohammed led to reflections on the role of lawyers in Egypt at the time, and the role of Egyptian court systems in protecting refugees, which at the times were not seen as offering much protection. And the case really that ended up being the first case of the Egyptian Foundation of Refugee Rights, that the case that actually brought us together, was kind of a useful place probably for me to begin my story, because it was a case of horrific persecution by a refugee in Egypt at the hands of the police, a female refugee who'd suffered sexual assault by a group of police officers, but who didn't want to go away and to disappear and to live in shame in Egypt, but wanted to pursue justice against her persecutors. And she met Mohammed, and he pursued the case at great risk to himself. In fact, not just to himself, but also his family, as well as at risk to the woman. To the point that he secured a conviction of all of the perpetrators of this violence and lengthy jail sentences, which the Egyptian legal system being what it is, wasn't, of course, the end of the matter, because there's one thing to get a judge to agree with you, another thing to get somebody behind bars. And so through this process of trying to explore and understand in what circumstances the Egyptian legal system might help refugees, particularly refugees who really had no other option in terms of getting justice, as was the case for this particular refugee, Mohammed and I became friends and brought in other lawyers and ended up founding the organization, the EFRR, which since 2008 has gone on to grow to a staff of 14 lawyers with offices in Cairo and Alexandria, and a network of 27 lawyers in all of the governorates of Egypt, from Marsa Matruh to Ismailia to Aswan. And the kind of the proof of concept, as awful as the case as it was, ended up leading to a program of legal aid that sought to provide representation to refugees who are facing detention and deportation, and establish precedents in those areas. To also, though, importantly, as with our initial case, help refugees who were victims of crime, either accused of crimes they didn't commit, which was often the case, as a pretext of getting rid of some sort of other complaint, usually for wages or something like that, or rent for refugees, or who had suffered crimes themselves. So supporting their efforts to have crimes against them prosecuted. As I said, it's grown into a medium-sized organization. In the last year, in 2021, notwithstanding the ordeals of the pandemic, which undoubtedly we'll have to discuss because that has changed the situation of refugees in Egypt. It handled 1,285 cases involving 4,325 refugees. Again, on those topics ranging from using administrative processes to register births to getting groups of refugees out of detention. I bring this back to Barbara because, I mean, in a sense, I think she was a woman with many ideas, obviously, but I think one of their central ideas that motivated certainly the latter part of her life, her many retirements, at least her first two retirements, as she would call them, was really the idea that refugees have rights, but not just that they have rights, but that refugee law has meaning. And it has meanings in places like we've heard in Uganda, but it has places of meanings like in places like Egypt. I think too often before Barbara's advocacy, there was this belief that kind of in many parts of the world, there was a rejection of refugee law, whether it's the Middle East or in Asia, and that as a result, other approaches were needed. And through her support of refugee legal aid programs, I think she managed to make the argument, and we've hopefully followed and continue this argument, that just because there's no national law that uses the word refugees, just because a state hasn't become party to the Refugee Convention, doesn't mean that legal processes, the legal profession, and legal institutions can't have a significant role to play and can't be leveraged for the protection of refugees. That local laws, local customary laws, common laws, local constitutional norms, human rights commitments locally or internationally can't be leveraged to protect refugees. Now, I'll close kind of in a sense with perhaps the most memorable case of the past year. And for me, it indicates both the possibilities as well as the very severe limitations of legal advocacy, including in Egypt. Over the last year, it was brought to our attention that a refugee had died crossing from Egypt into Libya. This is something I think we'll hear later on more about the predicament of not just refugees, but migrants more generally in Libya who are seeking to cross to Europe. This refugee's body had been brought to the hospital in Marsa Matruh, and it had sat there because there was no relative to release the body. And it was planned to be sitting there indefinitely. This isn't a happy story, but the lawyers of EFRR, the local member of our network, did advocacy and threatened legal action and managed to get the body released so that we could organize a dignified funeral in Marsa Matruh. As I said, it's not a happy ending, really. But for me, it epitomizes, even in small and desperate ways, the way that dignity can be reacquired and refocused on, even in very dire situations. Clearly, there's a lot more work to be done. That situation should never have happened in the first place. And that's ultimately the problem in terms of legal advocacy in places like Egypt and elsewhere. We're working on a new law, we're working on new policies, but there's a lot of work to be done. But even in those small ways, for me, Barbara's legacy is putting the individual refugee at the fore and to thinking about however bad and desperate the situation is, what can be done for the individual, not hiding behind large numbers or policies, but thinking about individuals. And so however sad the story is that I tell of our unidentified comrade, for me, it's a reminder of the need for that kind of ceaseless and in Barbara's case, is fearsome advocacy of refugees that EFRR every day tries to continue in its work in Egypt. So thank you.
And thank you very much, Martin, for the work that you're all doing, keeping Barbara's legacy alive, and also for reminding us the centrality of, again, refugees with rights, and also that the law in its broader sense can still, be helpful in making saving lives and making a change. So thank you very much. And as was pointed out, we're now moving on to another topic, which is quite contemporary in terms of the current situation pertaining people who flee conflicts. And to speak to that, we have Jérôme Toubiana, who works for the Libya migration advocacy at Médecins Sans Frontières. So over to you, Jérôme.
Many thanks. And well, prior to this, I worked as a researcher, in particular on the Horn of Africa and the Sahara, and in that capacity that exactly 10 years ago, actually, in 2012, I received an email from Barbara asking me for help for a family reunification case, actually from Chad, and we then kept having regular exchanges on both Chad and Sudan. And Barbara, I have to say, more forcibly than voluntarily, put me on a list of country of origin experts, which allowed me to receive impossible proposals from US legal firms, but more interestingly, that also taught me that experts affidavits can be of crucial help to asylum seekers. And one of the latest affidavit I actually wrote was for an Eritrean patient called Jonas, who was treated by NSF in Libya in 2019, and who now recently made it by himself to the UK. We actually made 2 short animation films about Jonas' journey. Unfortunately, they've not been broadcast in English, but you can see them in French, German, and Arabic and Italian. And it was an important experience within MSF because it had some success, but also because remaining in touch with Jonas was an illustration of an idea that together with some MSF colleagues we've been carrying since some years. And the idea that MSF, with interventions in countries of origin, but also countries of transit, in the Mediterranean Sea with a rescue vessel, and in countries of asylum as well, needs to find ways to connect the dots between those very different operations and to follow migrants' passions during their movements. So the report we recently published that is called Out of Libya, and that I will try to discuss now in a few minutes, precisely presents MSF's propositions to complement its medical and protection activities for migrant patients in a transit country, that is Libya, with the opening of pathways out of Libya, as well as individual advocacies for particularly vulnerable patients. So pathways to third countries, as well as reception activities in third countries. So I'll put later on maybe the report on the sidebar, but or a link to it. But the understanding first, let me begin with we started to work on those issues based on the understanding MSF has a kind of privileged understanding of the situation of migrants in Libya based on operations taking place in different locations in northwestern Libya, focusing in migrants since 2017. And since a year, we also have, as I mentioned, our own rescue vessel at sea that is called the Geo Barents. So in Libya itself, the first thing we provide migrants is, of course, medical aid, and most of our patients are victims of torture. As you know, migrants entering Libya are systematically held by traffickers and tortured for ransom. And then forced labor is also a common alternative to that payment. Many patients also suffer from diseases contracted in detention, notably tuberculosis, and mental troubles are particularly widespread. Women and girls are systematic victims of rapes, and some men too. And then most of our patients had also, had long experiences of successive detentions in different places, of forced labor, and of discrimination, mostly based on skin color. Just yesterday, there was a mob of Libyan armed civilians against Black Africans in one particular town, and that went completely unreported in international media, as far as I know. They, of course, many of them increasingly suffered repeated pushbacks at sea by the Libyan Coast Guard, supported by the European Union. Because to leave Libya, most will attempt to cross the Mediterranean once they can pay the fare. And there's been increasingly high rates of interception by the Libyan Coast Guard and increasingly high rates of drowning. So we, as MSF, we really faced, our teams on the ground faced huge difficulties in treating such patients within Libya, simply because once treated, they remain at risk in Libya. This is why we developed a protection component within our operations, including attempts at sheltering patients rather than returning them to detention or leaving them in the street. But those attempts, much like any similar attempts by UN agencies, by international or local organizations, remain very limited and very fragile. So I don't need to tell you that various international actors, including the European Union and the United Nations, have qualified Libya as a place which is not safe for migrants, a place where they are victims of crimes against humanity, and a place where they cannot really obtain the international protection they should receive. In the meantime, international responses, which have been focusing on the management of migration flows, fighting human trafficking, as well as supporting refugee resettlement, they look very much inadapted to that situation and already recorded many failures or counterproductive effects. So currently, I already described the main way out of Libya, that's crossing the Mediterranean, but there are also two main legal ways out of Libya currently. One is the IOM's so-called voluntary return to country of origin, and the other one is the UNHCR resettlement to third countries in Europe and North America. Since 2017, MSF referred cases to both mechanisms. I mean, if people were willing to return to the IOM, and if they needed to be evacuated to a third country, to the UNHCR. IOM has some advantages. It has no limitations in terms of numbers, of nationalities, and it has a quite better access on the ground. By contrast, the UNHCR is much more constrained. First, it has limited slots given by third countries. And this year, 2022 is particularly limited, only a bit above 300 up to now, and it's already half of the year. So we all very much worry about that because it's still a really, well, it's not the best mechanism on earth, but it's still relatively a relatively good option for many people. And then another main limitation to that particular mechanism is that UNHCR registration is only accessible to people from 9 nationalities. I should quote them. It's Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Yemen for the Middle East, and then for Sub-Saharan Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan. Only the Horn, basically. Then UNHCR lacks access to locations outside Tripoli, and they also stopped registering people in detention centers, which is a little bit of a problem for some who are stuck there, sometimes for long periods. And finally, the whole resettlement process is pretty slow. May well be adapted to refugee camps and relatively safe places around the world, but it's not adapted to Libya, which is not, as I mentioned, a safe place. So this is why MSF, as MSF, we call not only for increasing slots, but also for complementing resettlement with more adapted processes for the most vulnerable, processes which can minimize the loss of lives in Libya and at sea. So we tried a few things, and certainly it's kind of inspired by other efforts in other countries. And in particular, since 2018, we tried to refer cases to embassies, and we succeeded in getting humanitarian visas for a few medical cases. And then we had a little bit hope in another process which began in November, which is that of a humanitarian corridor from Libya to Italy, opened by the Italian government in agreement with the UNHCR and Italian charities, with more open criteria in terms of nationalities and vulnerabilities. In the most recent flight, third flight of the corridor a few days ago on June 30, on 93 passengers, we had 27 patients identified by MSF family who were evacuated directly to Italy. And 14 of them will be received by MSF Italy, that's our Italian section, in a specialized centers for victims of torture, ensuring for the first time some continuity of care. Indeed, in that model, which is what is potentially interesting, NGOs are both sponsors and reception actors in Italy. So we've been proposing since about a year to some governments a similar model of complementary pathway, itself based on corridors already working from Lebanon. In that model, NGOs could contribute to both reception in Europe and identification of very vulnerable patients in Libya, including medical cases who need a quick evacuation. While some could call that model a humanitarian corridor, others call it private sponsorship, and it's more or less the same in that case. And we try to advocate for it to different countries. So as you'll see, maybe if you read our recent report, we've been conveying a comprehensive set of recommendations. Those include those more concrete proposals for more efficient evacuations out of Libya, but they also include very crucial policy changes, such as conditioning European cooperation to Libya on migration with respect for international humanitarian law. So we've been trying to attract some attention, first on the situation in Libya, and we've been advocating for a response prioritizing human rights and proposing the opening of such humanitarian corridors in which NGOs can play a role to various governments in Europe and North America. But I have to admit that so far we got very little success, in particular in the UK and the US, and almost no interest from Anglophone media. That's a concern, and we would very much need support from other players working in that field in that part of the world. Thank you very much. So I'll just put the report on the sidebar now.
Yes, thank you very much, Jérôme, for again giving us an overview of the challenges that we continue to face. at this particular point in time, and therefore in a way the work that still needs to be done and that Barbara would like us to do in this area. And again, for reminding us of the importance of humanitarian corridors, humanitarian protection, and continue to advocate. And again, thank you very much for sharing the report with us. I also encourage some of the other speakers and participants to share reports of your current work with us in the chat, so that we can, again, know more of what goes on the ground. I want to thank the speakers for being so good with time, because it's quite challenging to have so many speakers giving an overview of the work they do over so many years in such a short space of time, which means that we have a few minutes left before I open the discussion for contribution questions. You can also put the questions you have for the speakers about their work in the chat, or talk about your work in the chat. We have time now to listen to one last presentation by Themba, and he was very much involved with Barbara in setting up the Rights in Exile. So we have a short video because it's many hours ahead and he couldn't make it, but we have a short video that maybe David can share with us, where Themba Lewis talks about his, again, how the legacy of Barbara's remains alive nowadays, and also about Rights in Exile. So over to you, David.
Hello, good afternoon from Dhaka, everyone. It's an honor to be here, part of this memorial for Barbara. I did spend a lot of time working with Barbara, and we started our professional interaction and our friendship in Cairo during the Mustafa Mahmoud refugee protest that happened around a number of Sudanese refugees who were protesting their treatment in Cairo by the authorities, by the UNHCR, and raising a lot of questions about responsibility and accountability, representation. What we see now is the refugee participation and leadership movement. Arguably, this was an early example of that. I stumbled into it one night, walking through Mohandassine in Cairo, and was roundly scolded by Barbara because I didn't know enough to be down there yet, and she was probably right. But it turns out that that protest brought us together in a way that shaped both of our immediate months and I think years. When that protest was dispersed by the Egyptian police, I remember being in Barbara's apartment in Garden City and being surrounded by cell phones and cigarette smoke and snacks and Sudanese refugees and Egyptians and any number of people all sort of frantically trying to understand what had happened the night before, when a number of people had been killed by the Egyptian security forces downtown. Trying to locate people who'd been detained, trying to reunite babies with their parents. And that was really where Barbara, that's where she shines, is when it's the immediate assistance. She dropped everything that she needed to do and immediately put all of her attention, her energy, all of her resources, and all of the resources of everyone around her towards creating a response that was respectful, that was comprehensive, and that was immediate to a situation of disaster that had befallen these Sudanese refugees in Cairo. From there, we went to sort of our different ways for a year or two before starting what was eventually called the Rights in Exile program. And Barbara told me at the time that after, she never admitted her age, but I did secretly find out, after so many years of life, she had determined that the most effective way to help refugees was through law, and that legal aid was the answer that she was going to invest the last years of her life into, and indeed she did. She decided, often said that what she wanted to do was take all of the information in her brain and put it down on paper, because she was worried she was going to lose it or that it was going to be lost when she was. And so we tried to do that. We tried to assemble a global infrastructure of legal aid resources, not only for refugees who may need them, but much more specifically for the idea of building a movement of legal aid. The tools, the resources, the ideas, the strategies, the documents that people would need in order to become capable to practice the defense of refugees and refugee rights. And that's not an easy task. I mean, she often would say that it's one of the most complicated areas of international law on the planet, and I think she's right. You're combining maritime law, criminal law, immigration law, all sorts of very complex systems into a contentious and somewhat ill-defined in some ways international legal framework. And without the tremendous skills required to navigate all of those national, regional, international levels, you can lose what she used to call death row cases, which are these refugee cases, where people might be sent back to dire circumstances, or maybe separated from their children, or may lose opportunities for lasting protection and a future. So we set about to build the Rights in Exile program. Myself, Barbara, and a few others, and you know who you are, in the early years, tried to create a directory of pro bono legal aid providers around the globe. And not only that, but tried to institute a little bit of momentum, instigate a little bit of forward movement towards greater refugee support through the building of case law, effectively, the training of lawyers. If not lawyers, then the training of people who were interested in law enough that they could put together an argument to convince UNHCR or to potentially convince an immigration adjudicator that this is somebody who needs protection. And we were fairly successful. We got a lot of contacts together. We were not as successful in terms of funding. It's a hard project to fund because it doesn't have a deliverable. It doesn't have an output that's measurable. It doesn't have an end date. It's a constant need. And we work to supply information and to do so free without any charge to anyone involved. So it was a noble, I think, endeavor, and certainly ambitious. And I still work with it today. It's cited to me. I've been doing a consultancy the last couple of days, and it's been cited in that consultancy multiple times. I then went on to work at the AMERA board, which I'd always refused when Barbara asked, but at one point I think she simply appointed me, and tried to carry on her legacy through AMERA, which was the NGO that I think many of you will know, in Cairo. And I think AMERA has is on a good footing now to continue. They have a new director in place, and I'm hoping that they'll continue. I've stepped off the board. I hope they'll continue in Barbara's name and with her vision to pursue those fundamental strategic objectives that she always had. Somehow she had a way of managing to really distill, and in an immediate sense, the bluster of a long-winded argument into a core point. And it's something that I admire, have never been as good at. Everywhere you go, people still say, oh, are you the one that worked with Barbara Harrell-Bond? I remember your name from those days. Or you scroll through a document and you find that, oh, this organization actually was co-founded by Barbara, or that she cited or referenced. And so many of the pieces of work that Barbara did continue to have relevance? Can humanitarian work with refugees be humane, for example? Imposing aid, I mean, obviously. So she does live on, and I know that she would not appreciate a memorial like this. But I will say that Barbara and I also had a lot of good times, and I do remember watching Downton Abbey. I don't know if she'd like that secret out, but sitting around and watching Downton Abbey and drinking wine and eating hummus and meeting so many good people through Barbara over the years and maintaining those relationships. And I have no doubt that those bits of Barbara that have affected me will continue to affect me for many, many years to come. And yeah, I hats off to those of you out there who are able and willing to stand up for the core injustices rather than let them wash over you, the way that Barbara stood up for them, fearlessly. I think that spirit is desperately needed. And so I hope that with this memorial we remember that and can carry that into the work that we're doing, whatever that work is. So thank you all, and I look forward to crossing paths again.
Okay, we've again had also the opportunity to listen to Themba, and I tend to agree with him that Barbara wouldn't want us to remember her work, but keep working and celebrate her life by keeping working and fighting for the rights of those whose protection is at risk. But we also see that Barbara had created connections across so many. So for those of you who knew Barbara, I'm sure that all these connections have been permeating in this virtual room. And for those of you who didn't know her, I hope you get a bit of a glimpse of what her legacy can be in terms of also networking. And we hope that this is also an opportunity for us to network. So I'm now kind of thanking everybody for, again, being here, and also the speakers. We would like to open the floor now. We have about 20 minutes for people to ask questions about the work that we've heard about, to share information, to share stories, to also tell us about how the legacy of Barbara is alive in your work. So I'm opening the floor for questions and comments.
Georgia, at the moment there are not questions in the chat, but I would like to read what Devota put, and she said, I agree, Barbara led from the front. Barbara's doors were open 24 hours to refugees, asylum seekers, and NGO practitioners, which is an example that the foundation really wants to keep alive and are trying to keep alive. For that reason, I put the link in the chat for everybody, because one of the projects of the foundation are microcredits to refugees and asylum seekers. And yeah, any contribution could make a life change.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And also the link to the archive, where you can have a look at the photos and publications of Barbara. Yeah.
I'll put that now.
Thank you.
I actually put the archive link as well. Do you want me to say some words in the meantime that we are waiting for? Sure. Yeah. So one of our projects has been to try to store safely Barbara work, particularly the visual work that Barbara did in Western Africa. And we found a lot of Polaroid slides that if we didn't do anything immediately, we would have lost them. So the project of the archive has been to save those pictures, but also to create a live archive where people can contribute, because many of them, we have only few details and informations, like, maybe the country or the town where it was taken, but we have no further information. So this archive is a live archive, and we are really hoping that everybody that knew Barbara or that have been to this place can give us further information that we can collect and extend this archive. So at the moment, there are nearly 600 uploaded pictures, but the archive is really big. And yeah, we hope we can keep the spirit of Barbara alive also by sharing this visual material that she produced.
Thank you, Gabi. Would anybody else just unmute yourselves, turn your camera on if you want to say anything? Or some of the speakers, if you want to add anything. Now I know that I ask you to keep your time very short, so you can also explain a bit more. Maybe I have one question. Can somebody say what AMERA means? What it stands for?
Yes, of course. So AMERA initially stood for Africa and Middle East Refugee Assistance. And so, of course, that was a region that was a significant focus of Barbara's work for a really long time. And so AMERA was established, AMERA Egypt was established as an office, and we have retained the name, although we have expanded the scope a little bit of Barbara's work. Although that said, our recent meetings in the region have really highlighted to us how it is AMERA's home, and how we do want to come back to our roots and really look at the work that we can be doing in Africa and the Middle East again.
Thank you, Sabine. Anybody else from the foundation that wants to say something? Because I'm only one of the number of us working to organize this event.
Georgia, do you mind if I ask a question myself? I would actually love to hear from those of you that are working in Egypt, how you are managing, considering that the situation there is not easy for Egyptians as well, for non-refugees particularly, with lack of freedom of expression or any basic talk or any basic activity. So in this environment, I assume the situation of refugees is even more dramatic than it was before. So I would like to hear how your work has been affected by that.
Who would like to go? Yeah, go Martin, yeah.
I could just say a few words. Yeah, there's a number of different dimensions, I think, of the struggle in Egypt these days, right? COVID has ruined an already stagnating, collapsing economy. Government services are collapsing as well. And then you have the, what is euphemistically called kind of shrinking civic space. So I think most of us who work in Egypt, even me who's not in Egypt, based in Egypt anymore, have friends who have either been forced into exile or are now, facing these kind of Kafkaesque processes. So I can only speak, so I acknowledge that context. And I think it's difficult for any type of activists, including refugee activists. So refugees who have protested have met, met the same kind of responses, frankly, that they met that Themba was just describing, after much shorter protests. So there's been violent repression of protests. in terms of running a civil society organization, I think it's been difficult. And, you know, it's very easy for me to try and profess the difficulties when Mohammed and Ahmed, my colleagues, have been the ones who have been trying to run it. I mean, the one thing I would say, and this was an issue, I mean, this isn't a new situation in some ways in Egypt, right? I mean, it's never been easy to be part of civil society in Egypt. I mean, certainly for the almost 20 years that I've been working there. It's never been easy. I guess the one thing I would say is I'm not sure that legal advocacy, to the extent that it's conducted in courts and through processes and by lawyers, and that's not all of our work, but I'm not sure that that is quite as controversial as other kinds of advocacy. Now, you know, the asterisk is that there's a certain amount of unpredictability, especially these days. But I mean, it's always been our experience that that kind of advocacy has been tolerated as part of legal judicial process in a way that other kinds of argument won't have been. So I guess that's the point I'd conclude with. But I mean, I'd leave more space and more time for reflections for those colleagues who are actually struggling on a daily basis with it.
Maybe I can jump in and say a few words. So being in Egypt and being on the ground here, certainly we face a lot of challenges. I would say for us particularly difficult it is for refugee-led organizations, so community-based organizations, as they usually can't get the registration status here, and then continuing to operate poses significant obstacles for them, both in terms of the, you know, getting funding, surviving on an ongoing basis. A lot of it has to be done sort of, you know, in the background, whereas like very forward advocacy is not possible. Even for us at STARS, our advocacy is more done on a global level, but certainly not on a local level. If on a local level towards UNHCR and international organizations here, yes, but certainly not the government or anything like that. Because as soon as voices are raised in that area, it could get very tricky. So that's sort of a situation that we face, and many of the community-based organizations that we work with, STARS works with around 30 currently, face the same issues, and only very few of them are actually registered and can operate normally and can get funding normally, whereas everyone else has to get funding through STARS or through other organizations. So that is the situation, and it has been getting more and more difficult over the past few years.
Thank you, Pamela and Martin. There is, I think, you put a question in the chat. How do we reinforce the rights of refugees and asylum seekers as Western countries stress benevolence over responsibility? Any of the speaker would like to?
Well, I'm speaking from the UK, so I guess I would question the premise of Western countries stressing benevolence, because there's not an awful lot of benevolence being stressed here with our offshoring policies. Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, how do we uphold rights of refugees when kind of the so-called exemplars of the refugee regime are overtly and like sometimes deliberately, flamboyantly failing in meeting their responsibilities. I've done a number of kind of international meetings like this in the last few weeks, and I'm struck by how, when you're talking to people from around the world, some policymakers but sometimes civil society, how much kind of the first question is, how can you make this argument, you know, typically for refugee rights or some sort of policy reform when I've just read the headline that your country is, and, you know, then they struggle to remember exactly where the UK is actually sending refugees. It's like, yes, it's Rwanda. I mean, I guess for me, part of the answer is in trying to root the arguments for refugee rights in local responsibilities. So in Egypt, there's a struggle there. I mean, but Egypt has itself signed the Refugee Convention. And so, independent of whether other states uphold their obligations, Egypt has to uphold its. But beyond that, Egypt has obligations to individuals undergoing government processes. It has ideas of fairness within its legal system. It has, a code of law that applies generally to all individuals in Egypt. I mean, there's some exceptions around civil status and whatnot, but so it's increasingly having to root arguments in local laws as opposed to the international ones. As much as the international law seems to bring us together, activists, and gives us a community of practice to work from. In terms of the local advocacy, it seems to be increasingly relying upon appeals to local traditions and customs. And part of me thinks that's hopeful because I think there's those traditions everywhere, but part of me is a bit depressed at the kind of the failure, in a sense, of the international project that you speak of.
Thank you, Martin. Georgia, I cannot see any more questions in the chart, so if we maybe let me just read what not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, Rachel. In Hong Kong, Barbara helped establishing a legal aid organization called Justice Center Hong Kong. We continue to carry on despite political difficulties. Here, we are inspired by your great work, love, and resilience. We draw on her continuing legacy. What is the most important gap? This is a question from Gail. What is the most important gap in advocacy at the moment, in the opinion of our speakers? Anyone that would like to?
I think maybe I could try to respond to that question in the context of Uganda. So for Uganda, when it comes to advocacy, I think one of the most challenging things has been advocating for the grant of citizenship for refugees and asylum seekers. So we have laws and policies in place, but implementation of the laws has been problematic. Whereas we have the Citizenship and Immigration Control Act that says if a refugee has lived in Uganda for 20 years, they speak one of the local languages, they are willing to be permanent citizens of Uganda, they could apply for citizenship by naturalization. But the practice is many of the refugees who are applying for citizenship by naturalization are not being granted, they're actually being denied because the government states that asylum is temporal. Once the circumstances that led to your flight cease, then you should go back to your country. So we are really facing a huge challenge in advocating for that because there is no political will to grant refugees Ugandan status. So this is quite challenging. And we brought an action before the courts of law. By the way, that was in 2015. So we went to the Constitutional Court seeking interpretation of the laws. The court clearly said that the law is clear and the department in charge of grant of citizenship should go ahead and do this. But it's still hard. Right now, at least we are seeing refugees can pick application forms and fill them in and submit. So whether they've been granted status is another question. So this is something we continue to push for, but it's not easy, especially when there's no political will. So for us, that is, I think, the most challenging when it comes to advocacy. Yeah.
Thank you, Suzanne. We only have 2 minutes, Georgia. Would you like to maybe either wrap it up, or if any of the speakers would like to add anything else?
Maybe I'll just leave 1 minute if anybody from the speakers of the audience would like to say one last word before we.
Maybe on my side, on the latest question, and being very short, I think the main difficulty, the main challenge we encounter is the difficulty to shift or put back the debate as a human rights issue and not just an issue of managing numbers of people and flows People are focusing on the numbers, and we have hard times to find interlocutors who are really willing to discuss human rights crisis. And to frame together an adequate response. And I think even among ourselves, we have hard times to sometimes not being trapped into that logic of discussing numbers and really discussing human rights. And definitely we need, I think we need more allies. We need people who are able to have that discussion.
Thank you very much for this this comment. The conversation continues. I think that maybe I can see there's another question for the foundation. Okay, what I'll just take this question from Cassia, even though we may go a couple of minutes over time, but I'll keep it. What in your opinion could be a useful role for the foundation to address some of these challenges? I think maybe that's an appropriate question. What could we do what do you think, those of you who are in this room, we could do to support the work? Yes, Martin.
An idea, and it just came to me as I was listening to everyone's wonderful reflections about Barbara, and kind of ties into my comment earlier about how Barbara kind of takes the idea of kind of being a fearless advocate, that's kind of embedded in the legal profession, and turns it into kind of being a fearsome advocate, which she certainly was for refugees. I would never have wanted to be, well, I mean, the few times I found myself on the other side of an argument with her was not a pleasant experience, but I've witnessed many other people's, often of high positions and status, many other people's clear discomfort at her advocacy towards them. But it occurs to me, there was a number of us who were involved in pushing Barbara as a nominee for the Nansen Award for a number of years, and there was hundreds of people who signed various petitions. She never got it, and I think we can probably guess why. But it occurs to me that actually one way of recognizing her is kind of, in a sense, I mean, you hate to set yourself up against the Nansen Prize, because, I have no doubt that whoever gets it every year does wonderful work. But it strikes me that there's a place to recognize the fearsome advocates, the people who take more risks in advocacy, who make enemies, who aren't as polished or as polite as they should be, and therefore get the recognition that other more mainstream prizes give. And so I just wonder whether there's some way of remembering her by kind of giving the kind of recognition that she kind of never got in a way, but which she kind of used because of the coattails of being involved with Oxford and her academic stature and all of that kind of stuff, but to kind of be able to lend some of her profile to somebody who needs it. That strikes me as something that would certainly be in keeping with the spirit of how she worked.
I think that's a brilliant way to kind of end this first conversation. Clearly, we are opening the floor for more to follow, and we will follow up with you, Martin, the idea of how we can create this activist award or do something that will again remember her legacy. So I just want to, I'm aware that it's 6:30 in the UK and we are ending the meeting. Well, this really, more than a meeting, this conversation around Barbara's legacy, and we see that it is very much alive and very much needed. I want to take this opportunity before we close to thank all the speakers who've agreed to come and share your experiences and work and challenges. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the members of the foundation and the volunteers for the work that goes on behind the scenes. So I'm just here today, but it's on behalf of everybody really. And I also want to thank you all for coming and in a way acknowledging her legacy and keeping her alive. So I'm just going to end this meeting by saying more to follow, and wish you all a good morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are.